The whole town laughed when the widow bought that rusted train car. They said she'd lost her mind, spending her last savings on a pile of scrap metal. Someone filmed her and posted it online with the hashtag Crazy Widow Project. But behind those dented steel walls, she wasn't losing her mind. She was building something that would test the heart of the entire town. No one believed her when she said the faded numbers U.S. Army 1943 on its side meant something. Then the blizzard came. The entire town went dark. Only the Crazy Widow's steel home still glowed through the night, and when they stepped inside, no one in Fairview would ever forget what they saw. The town of Fairview sat beside old railroad tracks that cut across Main Street, where train whistles had been silent for over 20 years. That winter was so cold that the shop windows cracked, and smoke from coal stoves curled out of the few homes with firewood left. At the end of the street, in a small rented room above a laundromat, Claire Dawson sat staring at a yellowed hospital bill. The cost of her husband Thomas's treatment still glared back at her like a scar that refused to fade. Thomas had died after an accident at the rail yard, leaving her a wedding ring, a few rusted tools, and a note scrawled on an oil-stained scrap of paper. If everything breaks one day, fix what's broken before you walk away. Since then, Claire hadn't slept through a single night. She took odd jobs fixing lawnmowers, unclogging pipes at the bakery, anything to stay busy. But inside, something restless stirred, the fear of becoming useless, forgotten. One afternoon, she wandered past the abandoned rail yard on the edge of town. Freight cars leaned at odd angles, their paint peeling, steel eaten by rust, the color of dried blood. One car stopped her in her tracks. On its side, the faint letters still read, U.S. Railway Corps 1943. Thomas had told her about those cars, how they'd carried American soldiers home from Normandy after the war. He called them the temporary homes of the ones who made it back. Claire ran over the faded paint, feeling the cold shoot through her palm. Then came the thought, reckless but clear as steel, if I have no home left, I'll build one out of what the world throws away. The next morning, she emptied her savings to buy the car. The scrapyard owner stared at her like she was out of her mind. It's rusted through, he said. The more rust, the more story, she replied. When the car was hauled through Main Street, people stopped to stare. Some filmed, some laughed. A young man shouted, "Look, Fairview's Crazy Widow's got herself a mobile home." Claire didn't react. She crossed her arms and watched as the train car lowered onto the empty lot behind the old gas station. The wheels screeched against the broken tracks and dust billowed. She smiled faintly, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not a house, it's a project. News spread faster than the winter wind. Only a day after the train car landed behind the old gas station, Fairview was buzzing. The corner bar, people played a short clip on their phones. Crazy Widow builds a train home. Laughter echoed through the smell of beer and cigarettes. Is she actually gonna live in that thing? Or start a museum of bad decisions? The hashtag Crazy Widow Project spread across every local Facebook group. Claire saw the video while buying screws at the hardware store. She paused for a second, then quietly turned off the screen. No reaction, no explanation. She just walked back to the rail yard, where the smell of rust and wind mixed with the faint scent of oil from the old factory nearby. She opened Thomas's toolbox and pulled out a cracked-handled hammer, a worn welding mask, an old cutter, and a few boards scavenged from a dump. Not much, but enough to start. By dusk, the air filled with the steady metal rhythm on metal. Clang, clang. She pried off bent panels, straightened frames, and reshaped steel. Her cracked hands bled, but she didn't stop. Claire wiped the sweat from her forehead when the sun dipped behind the broken tracks. An extended cut ran across her palm, bleeding. She tore a strip of cloth, wrapped it tight, and kept going. She didn't know why, but every strike of the hammer felt like her heartbeat, steady, alive, real. The next morning, she heard a knock. On the step sat an old can of paint, no name attached. Just a note. Paint your dream. Claire looked around, no one in sight. She smiled. Maybe someone out there understood, even for a moment. A few people watched from across the street that afternoon, phones out again. One shouted, "Hey lady, what are you painting this time?" Claire didn't answer. She grabbed her welding torch and etched words into the side of the car. No paint, no polish, just raw steel. Watch me build. Smoke rose, sparks flashed, then faded, and the hammer started again, steady, stubborn, defiant. That night she lay on the cold steel floor, her back aching, her hands raw and burning. But for the first time in years, she felt something unmistakable: life. Outside, social media still laughed. But inside that rusted train car, a woman was rebuilding herself. For 3 straight days, Claire didn't leave the lot. She survived on dry bread, instant coffee, and a stubborn will that no one could understand. On the 4th morning, as she was cutting steel for the window frame, a voice called out behind her, "Need an extra pair of hands." Turned around. A man stood there, gray hair, jacket dusted with coal. He introduced himself, Hanley, a retired welder from Amtrak, the same railroad company Thomas had worked for in his younger years. "Seeing you out here alone, I figured you might blow yourself up," he said in a raspy but kind voice. They shook hands. Hanley's palms were as rough and calloused as hers. He brought a thermos of black coffee and poured some into 2 cups. "Not much," he said, smiling, "but enough to warm the heart." Amid the smoke of burning metal and the biting wind, they sat on a pile of boards and shared stories. Hanley told her how he'd lost his job after the 2008 financial crash, how the bank took his house, and how his wife left soon after. Ever since, he'd lived in an old storage shed near the rail yard. Claire listened quietly, then said softly, "I guess you know what it feels like to be looked down on by a whole town." Hanley nodded. "That's why I'm here. Sometimes people just need someone to see that they're trying." That afternoon, they began installing a small heater made from recycled steel. Claire welded the pipe. Hanley checked the seals. The air was filled with the thick smell of burning oil. She struck a match. Whoosh! A blue flame burst out, nearly catching the curtain. Hanley reacted fast, pouring the rest of his coffee over it, smothering the fire just in time. Smoke clouded the space. Both of them coughed hard. Then they looked at each other and laughed. It was a rough, tired, genuine laugh. "Guess we just survived thanks to coffee," Hanley said. "Then tomorrow I owe you a fresh cup," Claire replied. After double-checking the air vents, they tried again. This time the flame burned small, warm, steady. The wind howled outside, but the soft, golden glow of the heater washed over their faces, tinting the steel walls with a color like old brass. Hanley looked around the train car and murmured, "It's not just the steel getting welded back together, you know." Claire frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He said, "you're welding your faith back too." She didn't answer, just smiled faintly and tightened her grip on the hammer. For the first time, the train car didn't feel cold anymore. Outside, a few townsfolk passed by and peeked through the small window. They no longer saw the crazy widow, but a flickering light, fragile and alive, as if life was restarting. Early one Monday morning, while snow still blanketed the old railway, a gray pickup truck stopped by the lot. 2 men stepped out, wearing jackets stamped with Town Council, Safety Division, clipboards and cameras in hand. "Mrs. Dawson?" "Yes." Claire wiped the oil from her hands and stood up. "We're here to inspect the structure. We've received reports you're building an unpermitted dwelling on leased land." Hanley looked up from tightening bolts near the back door. "She's not building a house," he said. "It's a train car." The taller inspector replied coldly, "Steel, walls, roof, chimney. If someone's living inside, by law it's a structure." He held out a paper stamped in red, "Notice of violation, unsafe structure." Claire froze. "This is legally leased property. Check the deed, please." The man shrugged. "Lease expired, and we have to ensure safety. After last year's fire on Pine Street, the council can't take chances." They snapped a few photos, then turned to leave. Before getting in the truck, one of them said, "You have 10 days to clear it out. After that, we'll bring the tow crew." The sound of the engine faded away. Hanley said nothing. Claire stood in the middle of the lot, the paper trembling in her hand. 10 days to prove that what she was building wasn't just a pile of scrap metal. That afternoon, the wind picked up, scattering papers from her workbench. She gripped her hammer, stepped outside, and slammed it against the doorframe. The sound rang out, sharp and metallic. Then again. The third blow cracked the hammerhead. She stood breathing hard, her hands trembling. For a moment, she wanted to leave Fairview behind, just like the dozens who'd already abandoned it. Then her eyes caught the oil-stained note from Thomas, taped beside the window frame. "Fix what's broken before you walk away." She pressed her palm over the words and closed her eyes. The anger drained out of her. When she opened them again, only a cold, steady resolve remained. Hanley watched her quietly. "What now?" he asked, voice gravelly but firm. "Finish it before they tear it down," she said. "They'll be back, you know. Then let them see you can't dismantle something built with will." Hanley chuckled softly and nodded. "Fight it with grit, huh?" "Grit's all I've got," she replied. That night they worked past midnight. The wind cut through the cracks in the steel, but inside, the rhythm of hammers, welding sparks, and quiet breathing merged into a steady pulse. Not of despair, but of 2 people fighting back through work. 3 days after the notice, Blizzard Gabriel hit. The FM radio warned, "Emergency level gusts up to 70 miles per hour. Residents are advised to stay indoors." But Fairview was an old town. Its power lines were outdated, and most homes ran on gas heat. Everyone knew one strong gust, and the whole system would collapse. When the storm arrived, the snow came down like walls. The wind howled long, sharp, tearing through the night. Streetlights flickered, then went dark. The whole town disappeared into blackness. Claire and Hanley were tightening the final welds on a wind brace inside the train car when the metal groaned crack. A support beam split in half. "Rope!" Hanley shouted. "Now." Claire rushed out, grabbing Thomas's old coil of rope from the toolbox. Her hands numb, snow slapping her face. Together they tied the roof down tight, anchoring the frame with bricks. A sudden gust slammed the doors open. Icy air and snow blasted inside. Claire slipped, slamming her back against the steel bed frame. Hanley pulled her up. "Still alive! Still alive!" she yelled over the roar of the wind when the roof finally held. Claire glanced at her watch. The power had been out for almost an hour. Then she remembered the generator she'd been fixing for 3 weeks from the scraps Thomas left behind. She ran inside and grabbed the pull cord. Once, twice, cough, splutter, nothing. Hanley shone his flashlight and steadied the frame. "Try again, Dawson." She clenched her jaw and yanked hard. The engine coughed, then roared to life. R-R-R-R-R-M-M. Warm, golden light spilled across the steel walls. Both of them exhaled in relief. Outside, the storm raged on, but the trembling lamp glowed like a heartbeat revived inside. Then a pounding on the door, thud, thud, a voice hoarse through the wind. "Someone please, my kid's freezing." Claire yanked the door open. A man stood there clutching a small child wrapped in a thin blanket, lips blue. "Get in," she shouted, pulling them inside, wrapping coats around the child, and guiding them to the heater. Then came 2 more people, then 3. Word spread through the town's group chat. "Light at Mrs. Dawson's train car, heat and power inside." One by one, neighbors came. Claire handed out blankets, poured warm water, and bandaged a woman's cut hand. Hanley brewed coffee in an old pot. That night, as snow piled high outside, the rusted train car became the only bright spot in Fairview. People huddled close, listening to the storm batter the steel walls. Claire looked around and whispered, "Thomas, you see this? We kept them warm." When dawn came, the town was still buried in snow, but no longer silent. In the heart of the blizzard, the woman once mocked had saved an entire community, with the same steel they'd once called scrap. 3 days after the storm, the snow began to melt, revealing collapsed roofs and tangled power lines. Fairview lay quiet and exhausted. Only Claire's rusted train car stood, its frame intact, chimney puffing thin smoke and a few children laughing, playing in the snow outside. A van pulled up, logo FOX12 local news painted on the side. A young reporter stepped out, camera slung over her shoulder. "Mrs. Dawson." Claire looked up, wiping soot from the chimney. "We'd like to do a story. The whole state's talking about the widow who saved Fairview." She smiled faintly, kept working as she replied, "I didn't save anyone. I just kept one train car warm. They're the ones who saved me by believing it was worth keeping." The reporter paused, scribbling the quote down quickly. That evening, the story aired statewide with the headline, "Steel and Grit, the widow who built warmth from scrap." The next day, the town council sent a delegation, but this time it wasn't a violation notice. It was a special permit allowing Claire to keep the car and a small community grant for safety improvements. The representative, Mr. Lowe, the same official who had signed the removal order, handed her the papers himself. He looked around the lot and said quietly, "I used to think this was a hazard to the town. Now I realize I was wrong." Claire nodded. "It's all right. I was wrong too, thinking I didn't matter anymore." The news spread through Fairview. Neighbors came to help. Some brought wood, others paint. Some simply stood nearby, nodding respectfully. No more pity, only quiet respect. As Claire was organizing tools one afternoon, there was a knock on the door. Evan, the young man who had once filmed her in Mockery. I want to learn welding," he said. "If you'd teach me." She looked at him, not angry, just calm. "You sure it's not an easy trade?" Evan nodded. "I saw you that night saving people. Now I want to learn how to fix what's broken." Claire placed her old welding gloves in his hands. "All right, but before you learn to weld, you learn patience." A few onlookers snapped photos from outside. One of them called out jokingly, "You opening a class now, Mrs. Dawson?" Claire turned, smiling softly. "Not a class, just a workshop for real life." A small new sign hung beside the door, "Still standing and building more." The following spring, the snow melted early. The empty lot behind the old gas station looked completely different now. A freshly painted sign hung across the train car's door. Fairview Makerspace. The small workshop was no longer just Claire's home. It had become a place where people brought broken things to fix, learn, and talk. Some donated tools, others donated time, and some just stopped by for a cup of coffee before heading on their way. On one wall hung black and white photographs of American soldiers and a 1943 railway car, gifts from the local Veterans Association, who had written to thank her for preserving a piece of history no one else would. Then one day Hanley didn't show up. Not that day, not the next. A week passed. Then the news came he had passed away in his sleep peacefully, leaving behind nothing but his old thermos of black coffee and a note scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Keep the fire burning, Dawson. When your hands weld, the whole town welds with you." Claire didn't cry. She simply hung Hanley's photo beside Thomas's, between 2 oil lamps, and returned to work as always. That afternoon, a thin 15-year-old girl appeared at the door, messy hair, worn jacket, cautious eyes. "Do you teach welding?" she asked. Claire nodded. "I do, but it's hot, loud, and I don't take quitters." "I won't quit," the girl said quickly. My dad just lost his job and my mom's sick. I want to help them somehow. Claire looked at her and saw a reflection of her younger self lost between grief and scrap metal. All right, she said. Start by holding the hammer steady. On the first day, the girl's hands shook. Sparks flew toward her face. Tears welled up. Claire didn't scold. She just said quietly, when something's not right, don't force it. Fix it until it feels right in your hands. The girl nodded, wiped her tears, and tried again. They finished their first project a week later, a small lamp stand made from scrap steel. The girl stared at it, half shy, half proud. It's better than I thought. Claire smiled. Steel only shines when it's burned at the right heat. People are the same. Word about Fairview Makerspace spread through the county. People began calling it the Workshop of Hope. Some of Claire's students entered the local mechanics fair and won the award for most creative recycling. That night, Claire sat alone watching the oil lamp flicker. There was no longer fear of being forgotten, only a quiet certainty. When people pass on their skill and their resolve, that's how the fire keeps burning. A year after Blizzard Gabriel, snow fell on Fairview once again. This time, no one panicked. Every rooftop now had reinforced vents and repaired heaters, thanks to the free blueprints shared by Fairview Makerspace. Claire was labeling a newly finished oil lamp inside the workshop, the warm light reflecting off her face. Beside her sat an old metal mailbox, repainted bronze. Inside was an envelope, no name, messy handwriting. Mrs. Dawson, because of you I learned how to believe in myself again. You didn't just fix metal. You fixed people who thought they were broken. Claire read it and a soft smile appeared, not radiant, just peaceful. She folded the letter and tucked it beside the photos of Hanley and Thomas on the wall. Outside, a few students laughed as they brushed snow off the train car's roof. The 15-year-old girl, now taller, was welding a bicycle frame. Careful with that flame, kid, Claire called out. I got it, came the cheerful reply. The sky dimmed, wind carrying the scent of snow, smoke, and a trace of mint from the small garden outside. Claire lit another lamp. The light spread across the side of the train car, glinting off the faded letters. U.S. Railway Corps 1943. She ran her fingers over the old paint and whispered, You see this, Thomas? The train still runs not on tracks, but through people's hearts. From a distance, a few townsfolk stopped to watch. Years ago, they had laughed. Now they just stood silently, as if wanting to remember the sight. The old train car was glowing in the snow, smoke rising gently, laughter echoing from within. A young reporter, the same one who'd filmed the blizzard a year before, posted a short caption online. In Fairview, a woman turned scrap into a sanctuary. A year later, her light still guides the town. Night settled. A soft wind blew across the snowy ground. The light from the train car shimmered like a beacon on the rails, steady, humble, unwavering. Claire sat by the door, holding a cup of hot tea, eyes lifted to the faint stars. She whispered, No one hands you a second chance, but if you're brave enough to start again, this world will always have a place for you. And in the heart of an American winter, the steel home, once mocked as madness, had become a symbol of something simple, that every soul can be welded back together if there's still enough courage left to begin.